Hello dolls and welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about one of my all-time favorite bands, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young. Helplessly Hoping, Our House, they have so many songs that are on top of my favorites lists. I honestly adore them, and there's so much going on with this band that I felt like it was really important to kind of break that down. So, if you didn't know, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young was one of the most successful bands of the 1960s. However, they only existed for a very short period of time, and their whole story was one of a genius disaster. It was brilliance and dysfunction, and as wonderful as the music is, and as great as these songs are, these four never really found a way to get along. And there's a lot going into this. There's egos clashing, affairs, tragedies. There's a lot going on that played into the history of this band that only existed for such a short period but has made such a huge impact. So today I would like to take you back to Laurel Canyon in the late 1960s. Welcome to the beautiful disaster that was Crosby, Stills, Nash Young. In the late 1960s, four musicians from different corners of the rock world drifted toward the same magical canyon in Los Angeles, each carrying both brilliance and the seeds of dysfunction. David Crosby had recently been ousted from the Byrds amid personality clashes. A free-spirited California rebel with a heavenly voice and a penchant for stirring the pot. Stephen Stills, fresh from the breakup of Buffalo Springfield, was a guitar wizard and prolific songwriter, nursing wounds from his band's collapse. Graham Nash, the golden-voiced Englishman of the Hollies, yearned for deeper artistry than his pop band allowed. And Neil Young, Stephen Stills' mercurial Canadian bandmate from Buffalo Springfield, was a lone wolf guitarist poet with a knack for vanishing and reappearing on his own terms. Each had already tasted fame, each carried scars from their previous groups, and each was searching for something more. They found that something in Laurel Canyon, a bohemian haven above Hollywood, where songwriters strummed guitars on sun-dappled porches and friendships formed as easily as harmonies. One auspicious day in July of 1968, David Crosby and Stephen Stills were harmonizing informally in a living room. Accounts differ whether it was Joni Mitchell's house or Cass Elliott's dining room. Graham Nash walked in and was immediately captivated. The two played Stephen Stills' wistful song, You Don't Have to Cry Once. Graham Nash, intrigued, asked them to sing it again. Then he joined in on a third pass with a high harmony that made David and Stephen's jaws drop. David Crosby later marveled that Graham Nash's voice was amazing on that top line. In that moment, the three realized they had discovered alchemy, the disparate threads of their talents braided into a single shimmering harmony, a sound none could create alone. By the end of the year, Graham Nash left the Hollies to join Crosby and Stills, and the newly minted Crosby, Stills and Nash inked a record deal. They were not just a band, they were a supergroup, each member a name proudly featured, no one subsumed by a clever band moniker. This union of strong personalities promised both greatness and volatility in equal measure. Chapter 1: Our House in the Canyon, Harmony and Early Success. From the outset, Crosby, Stills, and Nash experienced a creative chemistry that translated into swift success. They recorded their self-titled debut album in early 1969, each bringing songs that reflected their individual styles, yet blossomed in the group's three-part harmony. When Crosby, Stills, and Nash was released in May of 1969, it was immediately hailed as a genre-defying masterpiece. The album's opening track, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, written by Stephen Stills, was a 7-minute opus born from his love and heartbreak for the folk singer Judy Collins. Stephen had fallen hard for Judy, quote, making music all day and making love all night, as she would later recall. But by the time Crosby, Stills, and Nash formed, their fiery romance had cooled. Stephen poured his heart into Judy Blue Eyes, even referring to Judy's weekly therapy appointments in the lyrics as an intimate detail. In a grand gesture, he once serenaded her in a hotel room with a grand suite, hoping to win her back with his music. Judy was moved, but gently told him that although the song was wonderful, it wouldn't win her back. Heartache became art, and art propelled Crosby, Stills, and Nash's fame. The song became one of the group's signature pieces, its intricate sections and vocal coda showcasing the genius of their harmonic blend. This is something that if you've never listened to Crosby, Stills, and Nash, or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, if you're confused about why so far we're only speaking about 3 of them, don't you worry, I'm gonna get into that. But their music lives off of harmony, although this harmony isn't quite the harmony you're expecting if you think about something like, let's say, the Mamas and the Papas or Peter, Paul and Mary. It's a different kind of harmony. It's different accents, because one was from Canada, one was from the US, one was from Great Britain. So there's a very different way of singing, but that is what makes it so great. It's the way that their voices are so different, and the harmony is, I don't want to say off, but it does have a very special sound to it. For me, Helplessly Hoping personally, I think has some of the most beautiful harmony anyone has ever recorded. Their live debut came on the massive stage of Woodstock in August of 1969, a baptism by fire for a band that had played only one gig together prior. In the weeks before, they'd realized the hard truth. The debut album was layered with Steven's overdubs and intricate guitar parts, and the trio just physically couldn't reproduce that sound on stage. Not to say that David Crosby and Graham Nash weren't great guitar players, but they just couldn't play it in the way that Steven did, and so they knew they needed a second fire breather, someone who could cut through the air with melody and menace. Enter Neil Young. Steven knew him from the beautiful, volatile days of Buffalo Springfield. He revered Neil's brilliance, but carried real worries about his unpredictability, something that he definitely had all reason to be worried about, as we're going to see later. Still, the calculus was simple. If Crosby, Stills, and Nash were going to stand up live, they needed Neil Young. Neil agreed on his own terms, and the marquee became Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Under the humid skies of upstate New York, now a quartet with Dallas Taylors and Greg Reeves anchoring the rhythm, they delivered a stunning set that helped define the festival. Stephen Stills was so nervous facing the 500,000 muddy souls at Woodstock that he famously told the crowd, quote, "This is the second time we've ever played in front of people, man. We're scared less." Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young nonetheless mesmerized the audience with their harmonies and songs like Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. Their performance was captured in the Woodstock concert film, burned on film for eternity. "It was incredible," David said, of flying in the helicopter and beholding the sprawling sea of humanity, likening the sight to, quote, "an encampment of the Macedonian army, crossed with the biggest batch of gypsies you ever saw." The experience was so profound that Joni Mitchell, who wasn't at the festival, she watched it unfold on TV, distilled its spirit in her song Woodstock within days. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's electrified arrangement of Woodstock became a top 40 hit in 1970, perfectly capturing the story of the festival in anthem form. As Graham Nash remarked, by the time they got back to their hotel, Joni had essentially finished writing the song, quote, "By the time we got to Woodstock," her lyrics celebrated, "we were 500,000 strong." David Crosby later asserted, quote, "She contributed more to people's understanding of that event than anyone who was there." In those golden summer days of 1969, living communally in Laurel Canyon's idyllic scene, it truly felt like our house is a very, very, very fine house, as Graham Nash would soon write. Graham was then deeply in love with the beautiful Joni Mitchell, and the two had set up home in a cozy cottage in Laurel Canyon. One morning, Graham picked up Joni's guitar and spontaneously composed Our House, a sweet ode to domestic bliss, completed with 2 cats in the yard. It came to him after they spent a peaceful day together, buying a vase and picking flowers for their home. The song, later featured on the next Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young album, painted an idealized portrait of the bohemian love and simple joys they cherished. Such was the magic of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's early chemistry. Intimate, personal moments turned into songs that resonated with millions. By the end of 1969, the trio turned quartet was being compared to the Beatles in terms of cultural impact. America's Beatles, some said, a voice of a generation, emerging in the nexus of music and social change. Chapter 2, Deja Vu, Triumph and Turmoil in 1970. The rush of success propelled Crosby, Stills, Nash Young into 1970 with high expectations for their first album as a quartet. That album, tellingly titled Deja Vu, would become both a pinnacle of their brilliance and a testament of their dysfunction to come. When sessions began in fall of 1969, reality crashed into their Laurel Canyon utopia. The mood was different from the first album, Graham admitted. By the second, Joni and I had split up, Stephen and Judy had split up, and Christine had just been killed. It was all dark. In September of 1969, David Crosby's girlfriend, Christine Hinton, whom he'd called one of the greatest loves of his life, died in a horrific car accident. David was devastated. In the studio, he would sometimes break down sobbing, completely unable to deal with it all, as he would later confide. Her loss hung heavy on the Deja Vu sessions, fueling David Crosby's raw emotional performance on Almost Cut My Hair, a defiant anthem of countercultural identity that he sang with unbridled passion and pain. "I was not at my best as a functional person," David said of that time, and his tormented howl on Almost Cut My Hair, essentially an ode to personal freedom amidst paranoia, captured his turmoil. Stephen, worried that the track's ragged vocals were too unpolished, begged David to leave it off the album, but David stood firm and kept it over the protestations of Stephen. It stayed, and its rebellious energy became a highlight of the record. Meanwhile, Graham Nash, nursing a broken heart after Joni Mitchell unexpectedly ended their love affair, channeled his hurt into songs as well. Joni had, in quintessential fashion, sent Graham a cryptic telegram. "If you hold sand too tightly, it will run through your fingers," an artful Dear John message from afar that left Graham gutted. Graham's Our House, ironically written at the height of his and Joni's love, now rang with nostalgia for a domestic dream already fading away. Stephen Stills contributed Carry On, a dynamic opener stitched from pieces of an earlier song, and the gentle acoustic lament 4+20, which he recorded alone in one anguished take, practically quivering with exhaustion and dread at the age of 24. 24 and so much more, he sings, grappling with disillusionment far beyond his years. Neil Young offered the haunting Helpless, painting in simple strokes a longing for the innocence of a town in North Ontario, his childhood refuge. But Neil was increasingly estranged even as a band member, often skipping sessions, doing his part solo in Los Angeles, and bringing them in for the others to finish. On some songs, the four members were rarely in the studio all at once. Their contributions were layered separately, which made Deja Vu less a warm group hug and more a patchwork of four individual talents tenuously held together. Getting that second album out of us was like pulling teeth, Stephen admitted. It supposedly took over 800 hours of studio time amidst mounting tensions. One engineer observed that dozens of songs were attempted and discarded along the way. It's honestly incredible that Crosby, Stills, Nash Young ever put out Deja Vu at all, one writer noted, given the circumstances. Yet, miraculously, Deja Vu emerged in March of 1970 as a rock landmark, a 7-time platinum blockbuster that topped the charts. It spun off beloved singles, their celebratory rendition of Woodstock, Graham Nash's idyllic Teach Your Children, buoyant by Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead guesting on pedal steel guitar, and of course, Our House. Critics and fans might not have seen the blood, sweat, and tears in the grooves, but they heard the magic. One track, the title song, Deja Vu, had been so exacting to record that Stephen Stills joked it took 100 takes. The finished album plays like a beautiful yet fragmented time capsule of an era and the band at the crossroads. As one analysis observed, Deja Vu is, quote, a loose collection of ideas held together by a barely intact partnership, more like the Beatles' eclectic White Album than a cohesive statement. And yet, the sum of those parts was magnificent. The secret was in the vocal harmonies. Whenever Crosby, Stills, Nash, and sometimes Young opened their throats together, something transcendent happened. Their lush harmonies smoothed over the menagerie of contradictions, the clashing egos, the grief and joy, the differing musical visions, and unified them. Those voices blended in blissful concord even when the men themselves were in disarray, offering a more unified vision of the band than the individual members could ever conjure on their own. It was proof of the almost mystical synergy at the heart of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Four artists, each imperfect and utterly human, capable of moments of pure communal genius. Even as Deja Vu soared up the charts, reality intruded tragically on the world stage. On May 4th, 1970, the Kent State University shooting saw National Guard troops kill 4 students during an anti-war protest. The news hit the band members hard, especially Neil Young. Back in California, a shaken David Crosby dropped a copy of Life magazine with the Kent State cover in Neil's lap. Inside was the searing photos of a 14-year-old girl kneeling over a slain student in anguish. David Crosby watched as Neil Young, quote, looked at this thing and it hit him in the heart. Right there, Neil grabbed his guitar and furiously poured his sorrow and rage into a new song, Ohio. The lyrics were an unflinching indictment, quote, Tin soldiers and Nixon coming for Dad in Ohio. Naming the President of the United States in a protest song felt incendiary. Crosby called it, quote, the bravest thing I ever heard, that Neil dared to point a musical finger at Nixon. Within days, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young reconvened to record Ohio, live in a single inspired session. Quote, Neil just wrote this song, it's fucking fantastic. Get down here, David urgently told Graham Nash. They all assembled at Record Plant Studio in LA. Neil taught them the song on the spot and they blasted through take after take with raw passion. Quote, we recorded it in an hour and a half, Nash recalled. David Crosby was literally in tears as he shouted the final refrain, how many more, at the end of the take. They captured on tape the shock and anger of a generation in real time. In another half an hour, they recorded David Crosby's somber Find the Cost of Freedom for the B-side, a stark hymn with their 4 voices hauntingly echoing like Civil War elegy. Determined to get this music out now, they handed the tapes to Atlantic Records and demanded an urgent release. In just 12 days, an astonishing turnaround, Ohio was pressed into singles and shipped off to radio stations. Ohio hit the airwaves in June of 1970, while Deja Vu was still atop the charts, proof that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young could merge art and activism in real time. The song was promptly banned by some AM radio programmers for its blunt critique of Nixon, but it nevertheless became an anthem of the anti-war movement and a rallying cry for youth protest. For Dad in Ohio, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's voices lamented in unison, ensuring the nation would not forget the cost of violence at home. In that moment, these 4 artists truly fulfilled their generational role, musical consciousness responding to history as it happened. Chapter 3, Helplessly Hoping, Love, Loss and Internal Discord. Behind the shining success of 1970, cracks in the band's unity were widening. Fame and pressure were amplifying personal tensions that had already been there and smoldering from the start. Many of those tensions stemmed from romantic entanglements, a web of love affairs and heartbreaks that intertwined the band with some of the era's most leading women, and even with each other. As Graham Nash wryly noted later, quote, we had enough emotional shit going on for a dozen soap operas. Take David Crosby and Graham Nash, who had been as close as brothers since the band's birth. Both had been involved at different times with Joni Mitchell, a fact that never caused open conflict between them, but certainly added emotional complexity. David had dated Joni in 1967 and even produced her debut album, only for Joni to bristle at how David showed her off like a prized find. It was kind of embarrassing, as if I were his discovery, she later said. Feeling smothered, Joni broke up with David in spectacular fashion. At a party at Monkey Peter Tork's house, she performed a new song in front of everyone. That song about the Midway, which skewered David's infidelities right to his face. Caught You Cheating was unmistakably aimed at David. Goodbye, David was the clear message as she sang it twice for emphasis. Not long after, Joni fell in love with Graham Nash, entering a blissful period that inspired some of their most famous songs, her album Blue and his songs like Our House. But even that romance was not to last. By 1970, Joni felt stifled and left Graham as well, delivering her farewell with that poetic telegram from Greece. Graham Nash was heartbroken. He penned a tender, unreleased song called Letter to a Cactus Tree, lamenting competing with a poet for your favors, after finding Joni in the company of Leonard Cohen. Such was the romantic whirlwind swirling around Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, songs and hearts in constant motion. But the most infamous romantic saga to rock the band was the Rita Coolidge affair, a real-life love triangle that would become the stuff of rock legend. Rita Coolidge is often blamed for putting tension on Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and yes, she did, but it is that narrative that I hate so much of always a woman being behind a band breaking up. It's the classic Yoko Ono story, and we've seen it so many times at this point, and I do believe that the Rita Coolidge story played a huge part in why the band broke up. However, there is a reason why that was even possible, because this band was incredibly dysfunctional. There's a reason why over decades, and we're going to get to that later, they tried to have a reunion, they tried to pull it together, but they simply couldn't, and it wasn't all Rita Coolidge's fault. Rita was a stunning singer, but if you want to know more about Rita Coolidge, we've made a podcast episode about her. Abby actually wrote a phenomenal episode. The podcast is, as always, linked in the description box, so if you want to know more about her, Chris Christopherson, and everything else that went on, make sure to check out the podcast. Rita was a stunning singer who caught Stevens' eye in 1969, around the time Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young was forming. She first worked with Stevens, singing backup on his song, Love the One You're With. Graham Nash was also staying in Stevens' house and became smitten with Rita, and raptured, as a friend recalled. Graham invited Rita to be his date on a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young concert at the LA Forum, and he told her to call the house to arrange it. When Rita phoned, a jealous Stephen Stills intercepted the call and lied to Graham that she had changed her mind and would go with him instead. Unaware, Rita arrived at the show on Stevens' arm. Spotting this, Graham Nash was crushed and furious. Only later, a jealous Stephen Stills intercepted the call and lied that Graham had changed his mind and that Rita should just go with him. Unaware, Rita arrived at the show on Stevens' arm. Spotting this, Graham was crushed and furious. Only later, Rita did discover Stevens' deceit, at which point she promptly began dating Graham Nash instead. The confrontation came soon after. When Graham finally told Stephen that he and Rita were together, Stephen just came out swinging, as Rita would put it. The two men brawled until they were pulled apart. It was an unprecedented explosion between the formerly easygoing Graham Nash and the mercurial Stephen Stills, and it left their relationship in tatters for quite a time. Graham vented his disappointment later in a song called Frozen Smiles, thinly wailing lyrics about Stephen Stills' selfish behavior. Does it get you off to act so all alone? It'll chill you to the bone, he sang pointedly. The aftermath of the Rita incident was immediate. In the summer of 1970, mere months after the triumph of Deja Vu and Ohio, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young effectively imploded. The cumulative strain of ego clashes, romantic strife, and constant togetherness on the road led them to a breaking point. During a particularly tense tour stop in Chicago in July of 1970, Stephen Stills and Graham Nash's feud over Rita, compounded by Stephen's heavy drinking and erratic behavior, boiled over. That night, the group, at the height of their fame, decided to split apart. As David later dramatized in an allegorical song he titled Cowboy Movie, the band's collapse played out like an outlaw western. Four gunslingers, clearly representing Stills, Young, Nash, and Crosby himself, who returned from a train robbery, only to quarrel over an alluring Indian girl, a thinly veiled Rita Coolidge. In the song's climax, the character representing Stephen, Eli, the fastest gunner from the South, threatens to kill the others in a jealous rage. Life had imitated art so closely that it became art again in Crosby's hands. After that tumultuous summer tour in 1970, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young fractured. They announced they'd be taking an indefinite hiatus. The supergroup that had been crowned the voice of Woodstock Nation was, for now, a victim of its own success and excess. "We had to stop," Graham Nash said. "It got too crazy." And so each member retreated to separate paths, at least for a while. Interestingly, their creative engines remained on full throttle, even apart. Over the next year or two, all four members produced superb solo albums. Crosby recorded the haunting If I Could Only Remember My Name, released in 1971, pouring his grief for Christine Hinton into ethereal tracks like Laughing and Traction in the Rain. Graham Nash released Songs for Beginners in 1971, which included Chicago, a rousing protest inspired by the Chicago 8 conspiracy trial, and Simple Man, an aching reflection on his breakup with Joni. Stephen Stills issued his own solo debut, Stephen Stills, which was released in 1970, featuring the hit Love the One You're With, perhaps his answer to his lost love, and later formed a band called Manassas, delving into country, blues, and Latin rock. Neil Young, arguably the most driven of all, unleashed a string of masterpieces. 1970 came after the Gold Rush, followed by his legendary masterpiece Harvest in 1972. This made him one of the era's biggest solo stars, yielding classics like Heart of Gold. In a poetic twist, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, who together had struggled to produce one album, separately delivered 4 landmark albums in the span of just a year. It was as if the explosion of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young scattered creative shrapnel in all directions. The songs kept coming, just not under one roof. Chapter 4, The Doom Tour, Excess and Reunion in 1974. For a couple of years in the early 70s, the members of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young circled each other warily, pursuing their own projects and occasionally pairing off in twos. Crosby and Nash became a steady duo, touring and recording harmoniously. But the magnetism of the foursome remained, as did public demand. And by 1973, the idea of a Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young reunion began to tantalize all involved. They tentatively met that year in Hawaii, trying to record a follow-up to Deja Vu, often referred to by the working title Human Highway. Those sessions, however, flamed out in a haze of clashing egos and half-finished songs, leaving the promised album unfinished. It would take a greater incentive and changing times to truly reunite Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. That incentive turned out to be a massive stadium tour in 1974, a tour so over the top that it would earn the ominous nickname, the Doom Tour. By then, rock had grown into big business, and impresarios like Bill Graham saw Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young's combined star power could fill football stadiums. All 4 members had experienced career lulls or dissatisfaction with solo work by 1974, and the lucrative allure of a reunion, not to mention the era's copious drugs and adulation, proved irresistible. Quote, "We did one tour for the art and the music and one for the chicks. This one's for the cash," Stephen Stills candidly quipped to Rolling Stone's Cameron Crowe as they prepared to embark. The stage was set for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young to reconvene and conquer the stadium circuit as one of the first rock supergroups to ever attempt such a grand-scale tour. From the first show in July of 1974, it was clear this tour would be unlike any other, in both spectacular and problematic ways. Night after night, tens of thousands of fans packed enormous venues, often 50 to 70,000 people strong, to see Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, supported by acts like Joni Mitchell, the band, and the Beach Boys on selected dates. The band's performances were marathon affairs, sometimes 3 hours long, with electric and acoustic sets spanning their hits and dozens of new songs. On stage, when harmony and inspiration struck, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young could still be transcendent, their voices soaring into the warm summer night air, carried by the roar of the crowd. Offstage, however, the tour earned its due moniker. The feuding and partying that had always plagued Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were amplified by the tour's excess. As drummer John Barbada noted, quote, "It was insane. We were completely high every moment. Cocaine, marijuana, and sleeping pills too, because you have to come down." Indeed, cocaine was practically the tour's fifth member. Backstage, there was so much of it that the band reportedly invented a 10-second rule. If any coke was spilled on the carpet, everyone would drop on their hands and knees to snort it up within 10 seconds. Quote, "One of the biggest motivators for the tour outside of money were the large quantities of cocaine the band members were consuming," one chronicler dryly noted. David Crosby traveled with 2 girlfriends in tow, and his hotel room became infamous for unbridled scenes that would scandalize any unwary visitor. The antics were legendary. Stephen Stills, deep in a coke binge, insulted Bob Dylan to his face after Dylan dropped by and played him the entire Blood on the Tracks album backstage. Stephen Stills blurted out that the songs weren't any good. On another occasion, bassist Tim Drummond wore a t-shirt reading "No head, no backstage pass," encapsulating the vulgar bravado of the entourage. Stephen even began spinning delusional war stories, claiming he'd been on covered Vietnam missions and signing autographs as Stephen Stills, U.S. Marine Corps. The ego clashes resumed as well. Fueled by drugs and exhaustion, the 4 often bickered about set lists and spotlight time. Neil Young, uncomfortable with the decadence, isolated himself, traveling separately in a camper with his young son to escape the madness. By tour's end, all 4 men had literal nosebleeds from cocaine abuse, and their relationships had frayed to a near breaking point. And yet, for the audience, the music often transcended the chaos. The tour grossed an unprecedented $11 million. That would be over $60 million in today's money, in just 2 months, shattering attendance records across the entire country. Fans didn't see the fighting. They saw 4 hippie troubadours united under the summer sun, delivering the soundtrack of Woodstock's generation one more time. The demand for anything Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young was so high that Atlantic Records released a greatest hits compilation, So Far, mid-tour and without the band's input. Despite containing only previously released songs, So Far shot to #1 and went gold before the tour had even ended, a testament to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's superstar status. However, as David Crosby later pointed out, the extravagant production and large entourage meant the band members netted surprisingly little of that fortune themselves. Spiritually and emotionally, the cost for the Doom tour was even greater. By the final show, a massive capstone concert in London's Wembley Stadium in September of 1974, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were barely speaking. They delivered their set once more for 72,000 people, then effectively dissolved once again. Quote, "After that tour," Crosby reflected later, "I realized that cocaine had a terrible effect on everything. All drugs are not the same. If we had kept going, we might not have survived." The Doom tour had lived up to its name. It achieved glory, but at a price, leaving Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young again in shambles. 2 months later, in late 1974, the quartet made one more attempt to cut a new studio album together, their third try since 1970. But back in the confines of the studio, old resentments quickly resurfaced, and the sessions fell apart within weeks. Despairing of ever harnessing Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's mercurial chemistry, they abandoned the project. David Crosby and Graham Nash resumed their comfortable partnership as a duo, releasing mellow, critically acclaimed albums like Wind on the Water. Stephen Stills and Neil Young, meanwhile, teamed up for a one-off Stills and Young band project in 1976, yielding the album Long May You Run. Tellingly, that album had begun as another Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young reunion effort, but when David Crosby and Graham Nash had to leave early to focus on their own work, and in one instance to support David during the funeral of his mother, an irritated Neil Young erased their vocals from the master tapes. The record came out as simply a Stills and Young venture, with the two harmonies conspicuously absent. And in classic, capricious style, partway through the accompanying tour, Neil Young bailed on Stephen Stills with no warning, leaving only a laconic telegram that read, "Dear Stephen, funny how some things that start spontaneously end that way. Eat a peach, Neil." Neil Young's flakiness further deepened the rifts. By the late 1970s, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had become four islands, connected by history but separated by hurt feelings, addictions, and pride. Chapter 5, Wasted on the Way, Trials, Tragedies, and Triumph in the 1980s. The end of the 70s found Crosby, Stills, and Nash reconvening without Young, a bit battered but not beaten. In 1977, the original trio managed to bury enough hatchets to record the album CSN, often called the Boat Album for its cover photo. Surprisingly, after all the dysfunction, the music flowed easily. CSN was a polished, mature effort featuring hits like Nash's reflective Just a Song Before I Go, written on a dare that he couldn't write a song in under an hour. He did, and it became a top 10 single. The album topped the charts and went multi-platinum, proving the trio still had broad appeal. For a moment, harmony, musical and personal, seemed to prevail. But Crosby, deep down, was spiraling. Years of heavy drug use, primarily cocaine and heroin, were catching up to him. By the time CSN attempted another album in 1979, Crosby's addiction had rendered him unreliable. The trio's 1980s project, Daylight Again, began without him, only after intervention from Atlantic Records, who insisted David Crosby be included if the group name was to be used, did he participate, contributing minor vocals to a few tracks. The album still sold well in 1982, bound by Nash's poignant Wasted on the Way, a rueful tune openly addressing how much time the group had squandered through all the empty years of feuding and delay. We have all been wasted on the way, they harmonized on aching acknowledgement of lost time and lost opportunities that rang painfully true. By 1982, David Crosby's life had indeed reached a nadir. His insatiable appetite for sex and drugs, as he later put it, led to a series of arrests on drug and weapon charges. In 1985, after failing to show up for rehab, David Crosby was sentenced to prison in Texas. The one-time golden-voiced hippie icon spent 9 months behind bars, an almost unthinkable turn of events, but in a bittersweet twist, jail likely saved his life. Deprived of drugs, David Crosby finally got clean and sober for the first time in over a decade. True to their brotherhood, Graham Nash and Stephen Stills stood by David through this dark time, visiting him in prison and supporting his recovery. Neil Young, who had drifted afar from the trio in the late 1970s, offered a conditional hand. He told David he'd only consider rejoining the group if he cleaned up his act. And in 1986, David Crosby emerged from prison, healthy and revitalized, a survivor who had cheated death and found new clarity. The stage was set for the long-delayed reunion of all four. In 1988, exactly almost 20 years after their debut, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young released American Dream, the long-awaited, official Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young studio follow-up to Deja Vu. The album, recorded largely at Neil Young's instigation, was eagerly anticipated, and it did go platinum, but it received lukewarm reviews. Many felt the spark of the old was missing amid the slick 1980s production. Still, the mere fact of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young together and functional was considered a victory. They performed together occasionally, including a touching set at Live Aid in 1985, Crosby's first major appearance post-prison, and the foursome tour to support American Dream. During those shows, fans saw something poignant. These were no longer long-haired kids, but aging men who had been through the ringer and back. David Crosby would introduce the song Wasted on the Way by frankly warning the audience about the perils of excess and ego, essentially saying, "Look what happened to us, don't make the same mistakes." The music was still beautiful in flashes. Their lush harmonies could still silence a stadium with ease. And Crosby, his voice surprisingly angelic after all the abuse, sang with a gratitude that was palpable. Yet, old habits die hard. Through the late 1980s and into the 90s, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young continued an on-again, off-again pattern. Neil Young, ever the wild card, would drift in and out. In 1991, for a tribute to promoter Bill Graham, all four spontaneously played Teach Your Children together on stage, delighting fans who hadn't seen them as a quartet in years. Sensing renewed camaraderie, they tried once more to record fresh material. The result was Looking Forward in 1999, a gentle, retrospective-tinged album released under the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young banner. By then, the Laurel Canyon refugees were gray-haired, elder statesmen of rock, leaning into their legacy. They embarked on a successful tour in 2000, proving that despite everything, the magic still flickered when those four voices intertwined on classics like Helplessly Hoping or Ohio, stirring both nostalgia and a timeless awe. The new millennium saw Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young using their platform for activism once again. In 2006, with the Iraq War raging, the quartet reconvened for the Bold Freedom of Speech tour. Neil Young had written a fiery protest album, Living with War, and invited Crosby, Stills and Nash to join him in taking its message on the road. Night after night, the septuagenarian rockers lambasted the Bush administration, performing new protest songs alongside Vietnam-era anthems. Audiences were sometimes polarized. Some cheered the band's outspoken stance, others walked out, but Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had come full circle to their rebel-rousing roots. It was as if the spirit of the 70s lived again in these aging warriors, proving their influence on American music and culture was not just historical, but living and evolving. Indeed, their legacy loomed large. Countless younger artists cited them as inspiration for marrying music with political consciousness. Modern folk rock harmonies from groups like Fleet Foxes or Wilson Phillips from a different spectrum echoed Crosby, Stills and Nash's influence. Even the Grateful Dead had incorporated Crosby, Stills and Nash's harmonic lessons. Crosby, Stills and Nash had us way beat at they, admitted Bob Weir, of the Dead's shift to vocal-rich Americana in 1970. The Eagles, who became 70s superstars with immaculate harmonies, owed a depth to the trail blazed by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's intricate vocal stackings. They turned themselves into a choir, Weir said of Crosby, Stills and Nash's vocal blend, marveling at their technique. The Laurel Canyon scene that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young epitomized had by now passed into legend, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were its poet laureates. Chapter 6, Long Time Gone, Legacy and Farewell. By 2010, it was apparent that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had far more years behind them than ahead. They would convene only sparingly in the 2010s, mostly for special events. One such moment was the 2013 Bridge School Benefit in California, where Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young performed an acoustic set, their harmonies still golden, marking the final time all four would share a stage. Unbeknownst to the audience, it was a farewell of sorts. The very next year, a familiar specter returned, personal conflict. Neil Young decided to divorce his longtime wife Peggy and soon began a relationship with actress Daryl Hannah. When the ever-opinionated David Crosby publicly made uncharitable remarks about Neil's new romance, calling Daryl Hannah, quote, a purely poisonous predator in an interview, it incensed Neil Young. In 2014, Neil announced that Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young will never tour again, ever. And he meant it. Despite David Crosby later publicly apologizing, quote, where do I get off criticizing her? Daryl, if you're out here, I apologize. He offered continentally on The Howard Stern Show. Neil was deeply hurt and walked away for good. Around the same time, David Crosby and Graham Nash had a falling out over other grievances. Graham Nash had published a candid memoir that David Crosby disliked, and Crosby made disparaging comments about Graham Nash's personal life. The brotherhood was in tatters once more. After 2015, even Crosby, Stills, and Nash could no longer coexist. Graham Nash bitterly stated that Crosby, Stills, and Nash was over, citing David Crosby's abrasiveness as the breaking point. For fans, it was a sad coda. The harmonies that once symbolized unity and love were silenced by acrimony in the twilight years. And yet, time has a way of softening wounds. In January 2023, the world bid farewell to David Crosby, who passed away at 81 after a long, adventure-filled, and often perilous life. In the years leading up to his death, David Crosby had undergone a remarkable late-career renaissance, releasing several albums into his late 70s, collaborating with younger artists, and reveling in the joy of simply being alive and creative. But he also felt the sting of estrangement from his old friends. David Crosby often expressed regret about the conflicts with Nash and Young. In a 2021 interview, he sadly remarked that Graham was, quote, definitely my enemy now, and said he didn't expect reconciliation. However, fate intervened. Shortly before David Crosby died, he reached out to Graham Nash, leaving a voicemail seeking to make amends. Graham was hardened. He emailed back immediately suggesting a time to talk. Quote, he never called, and then he was gone, Nash revealed later, the regret palpable in his voice. Still, knowing that Crosby wanted to apologize made it easier to accept his old friend's death, he said. Quote, we were getting a little closer in the end, he shared softly. David's passing prompted an outpouring of tributes from his bandmates. Graham praised their, quote, deep friendship and pure joy of music we made together, choosing to remember the good over the bad. Stephen Stills wrote that he was, quote, happy to be at peace with Crosby in the end. Stephen lauded his falling comrade as, quote, without question, a giant of a musician with harmonic sensibilities, nothing short of genius. The glue that held us together as our vocals soared, like Icarus toward the sun, he added. I'm deeply saddened at his passing and shall miss him beyond measure. Neil Young, who had remained distant, simply called Crosby the soul of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and expressed love for David's songs, great singing, and his heart. In a graceful act, Neil Young later reunited with Stephen Stills on stage in 2023, playing a charity show where they performed A Long Time Gone and For What It's Worth in David Crosby's honor, the lyrics echoing with historical weight. As the surviving members enter their 80s, the story of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young stands as one of rock's most compelling sagas, a mix of heavenly harmony and human discord. They were four distinct personalities who, when locked in sync, produced music that defined a generation's dream of peace, love, and rebellion. Their songs became woven into the American fabric. Teach Your Children still comforts parents and children alike. Ohio still chills anyone who recalls or learns of Kent State. Sweet Judy Blue Eyes can still spark the spirit of 1969 on a sunny afternoon. Our House still conjures the warmth of domestic bliss, and Woodstock still makes one yearn for a time when music felt like it could change the world. They brought folk music's heart, rock's muscle, and pop's polish together in a new synthesis that countless bands would emulate. Each member is enshrined in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, with Crosby, Stills, Nash and with their prior bands, a testament to their individual and collective impact. They helped birth the idea of the supergroup and showed that music could be both beautifully personal and boldly political. Yet with great fire came great turbulence. Their tale is also one of clashing egos, excessive indulgence, and relationships strained to breaking. A cautionary tale of how utopian ideals can be undermined by human frailties. As Graham Nash once sang, "It's been a long time coming, it's going to be a long time gone." For Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the long time coming was the remarkable convergence of talents in that Laurel Canyon living room. The long time gone is the aftermath, the decades of breakups and makeups, of lost time and found wisdom, of aging and loss. In the end, perhaps Graham Nash voiced it most poignantly after David Crosby's death. "I can only try to remember the good times, because we had many. I want to concentrate on the good things we did," he said. And indeed, the good things shine on. The music of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, born of brilliance and dysfunction, tempered by the era that inspired it, remains an ethereal soundtrack of hope and reflection. It endures every time their voices unite in sublime harmony, inviting us to carry on even through discord with a song before we go. So that is it for today's video. That is it for the wild story of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. I truly believe that there aren't a lot of bands that can compare to the level of genius and disaster. There's no other way to put it. I feel like whenever there could have been a moment for them to come back together and to make another record, something didn't work out. And I do think that maybe they weren't meant to be in a band, but their voices and the music that they made was so truly magical. It almost feels like a dysfunctional relationship where you love someone so deeply and you have something so great, but it's also very destructive. I feel like that is what Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young boils down to. But yeah, I don't think I've ever said Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young as much ever as I did in the past hour or so. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what's your favorite Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song. I almost got to see Neil Young this summer. I really wanted to go, but he was playing this like huge outdoor venue. There were no seats, which generally I don't have an issue with, but he was here like 2 weeks ago or so, and I was very heavily pregnant already. It was also super hot, so we decided not to go, which makes me a little sad now because I do think it might have been the final chance to see him. I don't know, maybe one day I'll get another chance. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. If there's another band or artist whose life you would like me to break down, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to delve into whatever you want to know. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I make videos all about the 60s and 70s every single week, and I would love to have you around. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls. Where the sky meets the tree.